It was the summer of 2022 when my cousin Nate first told me this story. Nate isn't the type to lie. He's a Coast Guard officer, a straightforward man, calm and practical. He's been around ships, storms, and the roughness of the sea for more than a decade. He's not into horror or ghost stories. That's why, when he shared this experience with me, it shook me to my core. Because I knew, if Nate was rattled, it had to be real. The year was 2017. Nate had been sent with another officer, Russell, on a maintenance trip to a remote lighthouse off the coast of Maine. The place was called Martinez Rock. Imagine a jagged island, nothing but sharp stone and crashing waves, and at its center, a towering lighthouse. No power grid, no plumbing, no real connection to the outside world. You only reached it by boat or helicopter. The first few days were simple, windy, repetitive, a little boring, but nothing unusual. They fixed generators, scraped salt corrosion off the metal walls, tested the emergency batteries, and made sure the beacon light, vital for ships, was running smoothly. At night, they played cards, ate simple meals, and tried to ignore the emptiness around them. But on the fourth night, Nate woke at exactly 2 a.m. He couldn't explain why. The air felt heavy, like the sky before a thunderstorm, but the sky outside was clear. Then he noticed something strange. The lighthouse beam, the great rotating light, wasn't moving. He shook Russell awake. Together, they climbed the spiraling staircase to the beacon room. What they found still makes Nate uneasy to remember. The gears were moving. The machine wasn't broken, but something was jammed into the rotation. A huge piece of dark cloth. It was soaked, slimy, and smelled of rotting seaweed. Where it came from, no one could say. The door was locked, the windows sealed. There was no way it should have been there. They tossed it out into the wind and went back to bed. They told themselves it was a bizarre accident. But the next night, just after 2 a.m., it happened again. This time the object was smaller, a red frayed scarf, ocean water still dripping from it, tiny barnacles clinging to the threads. It looked as if it had just been pulled out of the sea. That was the moment Nate realized something was seriously wrong. From then on, they blocked the stairwell with heavy crates. They checked every door, every window. They locked the beacon room. But the strangeness only escalated. On the 7th night, Nate woke to find Russell whispering to the corner of the room, his eyes half open, words broken and meaningless. When Nate asked who he was talking to, Russell blinked in confusion and said he hadn't been speaking at all. The following night, Russell stood frozen by the window, staring down at the rocks. When Nate approached, Russell muttered that he saw someone down there in the faint sweep of the light, watching them. But when the beam turned again, the figure was gone. And then came the footsteps. On the 9th night, both men heard them clearly. Slow, deliberate, from above, from the beacon room. Neither Nate nor Russell had gone upstairs, but someone, or something, was walking there. That night they pushed a dresser against their door and slept with knives beneath their pillows. By the 11th night, the beacon failed again. When they reached the top, the heavy door had been thrown wide open. Inside, the light bulb had been unscrewed. An industrial bulb, one that takes force to remove, was standing upright in the center of the room, as if carefully placed there. Russell went pale. He swore he saw a hand emerge from the wall, pale and dripping wet, only to vanish again. Nate felt something cold brush against his back. That was it. He used the emergency satellite phone and demanded extraction. When the boat came, the crew said something that still makes Nate's blood run cold. They had already received a call from the lighthouse earlier that night, around 2:12 a.m., a distress signal, garbled, filled with static, and a faint voice repeating, "Someone is here with us." But Nate never made that call. Russell quit the Coast Guard a few months later, and to this day, Nate refuses to set foot on Martinez Rock again. For the first week after leaving Martinez Rock, Nate didn't sleep well. Every night he woke at 2 a.m., heart racing, certain that someone or something was in the room with him. Eventually, the nightmares faded. Life went on. But Russell, he didn't recover. Russell became withdrawn. He stopped answering calls. A few weeks later, Nate heard from another officer that Russell had been admitted to a psychiatric ward. He kept muttering about the woman in the water and scratching his arms raw, as if trying to peel off invisible seaweed clinging to his skin. Nate tried to bury the memories. He told himself it had been stress, exhaustion, maybe even mass hysteria. But 2 years later, in late autumn of 2019, the Coast Guard reached out again. They needed Nate back at Martinez Rock. A supply boat had failed to return from a routine trip. Radar logs showed the vessel approaching the island, but it never came back. No wreckage, no signal, just silence. Nate resisted. He begged to be assigned elsewhere, but orders were orders. Within days, he found himself standing once again on the jagged rocks of that cursed island. This time he wasn't with Russell. He was accompanied by a new partner, a young recruit named Ellis. The moment Nate stepped off the boat, he felt it. That same heavy air, that strange vibration in the stone beneath his boots. It was like the island itself was alive, waiting. Ellis was excited, chatting non-stop, treating it like an adventure. But as soon as night fell, the mood shifted. The lighthouse groaned with the wind, metal hinges rattled, and the sea slammed against the rocks like an endless drumbeat. At exactly 2 a.m., Nate heard it again. Footsteps. Above them. He froze. Ellis, half asleep, asked if he'd gone upstairs. Nate shook his head. The sound came again, slow, deliberate, moving in circles around the beacon room. Summoning courage, Nate led Ellis up the spiral stairs. The door was locked, exactly as they had left it. But from the other side came a low, dragging sound, like wet fabric being pulled across the floor. When they finally forced the door open, the room was empty. Only the great glass eye of the beacon stared down at them, but in the center of the floor lay a trail of seawater. Fresh. Ellis laughed nervously, called it a leak. But Nate knew better. On their second night, Ellis didn't laugh. He stood by the window, pale as death, whispering that someone was waving at him from the rocks below. Nate looked, but there was nothing. Only waves crashing endlessly. That same night, their generator failed. In the pitch-dark silence, Nate heard a voice calling his name. Not shouting, not whispering, just a calm, steady voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. When light returned, Ellis was gone, his bunk empty, his boots still by the door. Nate searched the entire lighthouse. He searched the rocks, the shoreline, calling Ellis's name. No answer, only the echo of the sea. Finally, he climbed to the beacon room once more, and there, beneath the sweeping light, he saw Ellis. Standing perfectly still, his eyes wide, his skin wet and glistening as though he had just stepped out of the ocean. He smiled faintly, but it wasn't his smile. Nate backed away in terror. Ellis raised his arm slowly, and in his hand was the same red, frayed scarf from 2 years ago, the one that should have been lost forever to the waves. Nate bolted down the stairs, slammed the heavy doors, and locked himself inside the generator room. For hours he listened, to footsteps pacing the hall, to knocks on the door, to a voice, Ellis's voice, but not quite, pleading, begging, demanding to be let in. When dawn finally broke, the sounds stopped. The rescue boat arrived that afternoon. They found Nate trembling, refusing to leave the generator room until they dragged him out. There was no sign of Ellis, no footprints, no belongings missing, as though he had never been there at all. But the lighthouse logbook told a different story. On the final page, written in Ellis's handwriting, was a single line. The woman from the water has come inside. Nate resigned from the Coast Guard soon after. He's never spoken of Martinez Rock again. And to this day, the Coast Guard avoids staffing the lighthouse for more than 3 nights at a time, because every time the clock strikes 2 a.m., the light still stops turning.